Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking with the architecture and design critic of The Guardian, Oliver Wainwright. Oliver has been writing at The Guardian since 2012 and previously wrote for publications like Building Design, The Architect's Journal, and Icon. Before transitioning to journalism, he studied architecture and worked in a number of studios, including OMA. Last year, he published Inside North Korea, a book of photographs of the architecture in North Korea. In this conversation, Oliver and I talk about his interest in writing and why he left architecture practice. We talk about the challenges with writing for a general audience for a newspaper like The Guardian, the role of the critic, and that sometimes tricky position of being both a critic and a practitioner. I have been reading Oliver's writing for years. I'm a big fan and was excited to finally have him on the podcast. I think you'll really enjoy this one. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I like to think of as the director's commentary for the podcast. Each month I share additional content, episode previews, and short essays related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Oliver Wainwright. What's interesting to me about you is that you studied architecture, you worked as an architect, and then as somebody who's been reading your work from afar, made what seems like a very sudden turn into journalism, criticism, writing. And I kind of want to start there, actually, and I'm curious about that transition. Was it as sudden as it seems like kind of in retrospect, or what was your interest? Where were you at the time when you kind of started writing? How did all this come about?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. And I guess actually it was much more gradual than maybe it seems from the outside. So as you say, I trained to be an architect. I did my undergraduate at the University of Cambridge. And then my first kind of year out working in practice, I actually went to work for the Mayor of London, for the Greater London Authority when Ken Livingstone was the mayor. So a fairly kind of radical left-wing mayor. Yeah. And they just set up a little team called the Architecture and Urbanism Unit, which was a small group of architects kind of working within the GLA, kind of within the political sphere. And I suppose that was the stage that really kind of triggered my interest in the power of writing potentially beyond the power of designing, because a lot of my job, this was the kind of first job I had straight out of school, was writing reports and writing kind of design reviews and quite kind of political documents that would end up, trying to influence the nature of certain developments. And it was fascinating, getting this exposure to the kind of behind the scenes mechanisms, the way that London was actually being shaped in the run up to the Olympics. So I think it was then that I started doing some freelance writing. Then I moved to Rotterdam to work at OMA, to work on some competitions and things like that. And again, when I was there, I ended up drifting into AMO, which is the so-called research think tank. From the outside, it sounds like this very kind of glamorous, research cluster within the office, but it's basically the same thing as OMA. It's just interns gathered around Wikipedia and in design, desperate making books and doing research. But it was the side of the office that I found fascinating, because it was a much more kind of journalistic, research-led process. And when I was in Rotterdam, that's when I started actually writing for magazines. So that would have been about 2007, 8, I think, that I started having some articles published in things like Icon magazine and the Architect's Journal and Building Design. Just little things like little reviews or interviews with architects that I'd met. Then I came back to London and did my master's at the Royal College of Art. And again, it was this whole process. All the time I was studying architecture, I actually found much more kind of pleasure and reward in the writing I was doing on the side. Whether it was, writing the kind of arguments and descriptions behind my own projects or writing about other people's work. So I just ended up doing more and more kind of freelance work on the side, really. I was very lucky when I graduated in 2010. Building Design magazine was having a bit of a shake-up, and the guy that had been the architecture critic became the editor, Ellis Woodman.
Okay.
And he approached me, literally on my graduation day saying, do you want my job? Do you want to be the full-time critic of the UK's most read architecture magazine? So it was a bit annoying, to be honest, because I'd been planning to go into practice and thought, okay, I can, have a practice and kind of write part-time and do both, which is the ultimate dream. And then was suddenly offered this full-time job as a critic that was too good to turn down.
Yeah.
So, that's what I did.
I have a couple questions. I actually find that really fascinating. I have a couple questions about that trajectory. So you kind of finished your undergrad and you got this job working for the mayor, and you found yourself writing a lot. What was your writing experience like at that point? Had you done any writing? Did you know you had an interest in writing or a talent or a bend there?
I suppose it was a very different kind of writing. I mean, the reason I chose Cambridge to study architecture is that of the architecture schools in the UK, it's probably the one that has the strongest kind of history and theory side to the program. So I suppose throughout those 3 years of undergraduate study, I'd written a lot of kind of essays and kind of critical pieces. I suppose mainly of a more historic nature. And then, shifting to the GLA, it was almost like having to be a kind of historian of the present, which is, I suppose, what criticism is.
Right.
I was faced with these very uninspiring planning applications for speculative apartment buildings in East London. This is the Olympics. The 2012 Olympics had just been announced.
Oh, right.
So a lot of developers were there was a kind of gold rush to East London, producing these very cheap designs for high-rise speculative towers, and I was having to kind of write criticism on the schemes, and then that would be fed into the planning process.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it was like being dropped in at the deep end. I must have been about 20, I guess, maybe, or 19, and suddenly you're sitting in meetings with middle-aged architects telling them that they could do a bit better with their design.
Yeah.
I think that's what gave me the confidence, the kind of insane confidence that maybe you shouldn't have at that age, but you're kind of forced to when you're in that kind of job. I thought, okay, I do have opinions, and I believe in these opinions, so maybe I can somehow make a living out of having well-argued opinions. That's what criticism is, I suppose.
When you went back to school for your master's, and you mentioned that you kind of were enjoying this more writing and kind of research and thinking side, and especially at AMO, and then you graduated and you thought you were going to go into practice. I'm kind of curious about, I don't mean for this to get too
what if?
Yeah, but what were you kind of thinking? What kind of practice were you interested in, and did you even think about full-time writing? Was that even something that kind of had crossed your mind, or were you kind of set on this practice?
No, I'd never considered full-time writing, to be honest. I was determined to be a designer and an architect of some kind. And I set up an office with a couple of friends while we were still studying at the RCA. We all found ourselves drifting towards the same topic, which again, it was the Olympic site, because that was such a kind of politically contentious thing at the time in East London. It was being seen as this kind of steamroller of fast-track gentrification that was seeing the forced displacement of communities and industry and kind of fragile businesses from the lower Lee Valley. So we all kind of came together and did a project, a kind of speculative project about an alternative Olympic legacy. We were called Studio Super Niche, because all of the topics that we would somehow be quite kind of niche interests.
Oh man, I love that.
And it was 2 architects, a product designer and a sculptor. And then, so we did this project. We actually took it to the Rotterdam Biennale in 2009 and won the kind of student prize for the Biennale. And we thought, yes, this is our first project. We're going to go on and do great things. And then a few months later, when we graduated, we kind of disbanded because we actually realized that we all had quite different interests. The furniture designers kind of went off and became, solo designers. I ended up going to Building Design magazine. So yeah, it kind of fizzled out. That's what could have been if I'd have.
That's so interesting.
And the idea was to somehow cross over between, I suppose quite a research-driven model. So that's what we were really interested in, like researching the forces that were causing this kind of fast-track gentrification and displacement, but then making, I suppose, slightly kind of speculative, propositional architectural structures that kind of embody practice, which have been very commercialist.
Now, you were kind of interested in this practice that was very research-driven and kind of looking at these kind of external forces and how they were influencing the work itself. And then you find yourself in a job where you are basically just writing about this, right? What was that like to kind of, I imagine you were kind of taking these same themes, these same questions you had, but instead of applying them to buildings or projects, you're applying them to essays and reviews, etc. Was that a big jump to you, or did it feel like a kind of continuation of what you were thinking about?
It probably should have felt like a bigger jump than it was. And I think the problem was ultimately that I was never a very kind of comfortable designer. And so, whenever I was faced with a site or a brief, I would much rather have kind of written an analysis or a critique or a piece of text about the situation and kind of explaining what was already there, I suppose, rather than feeling that I had the confidence to impose my own vision on the site. And so, to be honest, design was always a kind of existential struggle, whereas writing just seemed to come much more naturally. And I think ultimately you do end up doing what you're good at. And I knew that I was a much better writer than designer. I would have loved to be an architect, but it was just something that didn't kind of come naturally.
Yeah.
Whereas the writing, and I also, to be honest, I found the reality of practice so different to what you're kind of led to believe.
Yeah.
I'm sure you found the same. When you're studying in school, the conversations and the kinds of ideas that you're exploring, are so exciting and so fascinating. And then you join a practice, and most of your time is spent staring at AutoCAD, 24 hours a day, clicking lines, and it's a very soul-destroying, mind-numbing job. I always tell people, like, the reality of being an architect, the kind of technical information that has to be produced to make a building is just mind-boggling, and the kind of creative, critical process is a fraction of that time.
Right.
And so I would always sit in meetings or be kind of eavesdropping on meetings and wishing that I was, having that conversation and could, talk to the kind of partners and the directors rather than being the kind of lowly intern. And I suppose as a journalist, that's what you do. You have the conversations with the people that are actually making the decisions, and the clients and the planners and the funders, and you're kind of operating at that level rather than being a cog in the machine of a much bigger practice.
I've talked to a bunch of architecture writers who came from practice or who studied architecture and then found themselves in roles where they're writing or are architects and then are also writing at the same time. And I'm very interested in the relationships or the intersections between kind of architecture practice or architecture education, and maybe we don't even have to limit it to architecture. We could just say design in general, and like the training of a designer or an architect, how that feeds into or influences writing and the writing process. And I'm curious your thoughts on going through this architecture education. How does that influence how you think about writing or even your role as a writer?
That's a really good question. And I think it's kind of essential, I think, to being a critic. It's a discipline like architecture. I think to have studied it is it's just a really helpful thing, but partly because it gives you a level of sympathy and empathy with architects. I think it's incredibly difficult to make a building, let alone a good building, and it's important to know just quite how hard it is and all of the obstacles that are put in the way. But I think more fundamentally, it's important to go through that to know quite how powerless the architect is. because I would always say, and this was my pitch to the Guardian when I applied for the job, about 7 years ago now, that actually the architect is such a kind of small figure in the bigger picture of urban development. And when you're in practice, you really realize that, you're at the mercy of the client, of the funder, of the planning officer, of all these much bigger, often kind of invisible forces behind the scenes that are shaping the city and shaping architecture.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's what I always try and focus on in my writing. I think it's the critic's job to kind of unpick that system and shine a spotlight on the kind of hidden world, that's not just the architect in their ivory tower, drawing the design. That's not how buildings get made. That's a very small element of it. And it's the flows of capital and the planning policy loopholes and all of these other things which really have the kind of fundamental influence on how buildings and spaces turn out.
I recently talked to Rainier de Graaf actually about AMO, but also about his book Four Walls and a Roof, which in our conversation we kind of say that basically what you just said is kind of the thesis of that book, is that architects like to sometimes pitch themselves, and I'll throw designers in this, as these kind of future world builders, and they can kind of dream these things out of nowhere, when in reality it's actually a very reactive discipline. And I found his writing on that to be very refreshing, because it's not always talked about. And I think your writing does that also. And I don't mean to draw too many connections, but I'm wondering if that did you get some of that influence when you were at OMA, or when you were in practice, were you kind of feeling that, and has that influenced how you kind of approach your work now?
It's funny, actually, because I know Rainier well. He was one of my bosses when I was at OMA. But to be honest, it's a very strange position to have, I find, as a practicing architect, to be so cynical about your own work. Because in a way, the thesis of OMA now is so cynical. They're almost kind of openly critical of their own work. When I went to review the De Rotterdam project, which is this gargantuan office and apartment building in Rotterdam, which they've been working on for about 15 years. Rem insisted on kind of driving me to the building across the bridge, because he was so obsessed with the kind of formal effect as you cross the bridge and the view changes. And then we got to the other side, and he let me out, and he said, to be honest, that's all you need to see. The rest of it's just a cheap speculative office building. And I kind of thought, okay, well, that's going in my article. This is a guy who's kind of openly, blatant about the expedient way that they work. And it's refreshing in a way, but I do find their attitude hasn't really helped. If you look at the quality of the buildings coming out of the office over the last 10 years, they're just not very good anymore. They're kind of sub Foster. Team D at Foster and Partners are producing interesting buildings, and I find that cynicism actually not very helpful when you're in a practice. I think Rainier is a brilliant writer and a brilliant lecturer and incredibly entertaining. But I almost wish he would kind of step outside the practice and be, throwing the missiles in from the outside rather than producing these mindless buildings.
Yeah, that's actually, I didn't think about it that. I don't disagree with how you just framed that. And I was, obviously I read the book as somebody who's not in the architecture world. And so I was reading it as an outsider, and I'm wondering if that kind of shaped now how I read it, and even when I talked to him. But the thing that I found refreshing about it is that I feel like today it's very easy for designers in general, this is a blanket statement, and I'm including myself in this, I probably am guilty of this on this podcast, of kind of singing the praises of design as this thing that can solve any problem. There's a certain kind of colonization of designers kind of going out in the world solving all these different problems, and as good as I think that is, I also think there's a certain arrogance to that I'm starting to kind of rub up against in a weird way. And I felt like his book and the way he kind of talked about it was kind of saying, yeah, there is some of that, but we also have to then keep in mind on the other side. But you're letting me see it in a different way.
Yeah, I find it very problematic in his case. I think it's a kind of laundering of his conscience. So, he's incredibly complicit in the kinds of forces that he criticizes. It's fine to rage against, speculative apartment buildings and the kind of dangerous forces of overseas capital, but then don't go and work for those clients.
Right.
He's very conscious that a lot of the work they're doing, I think, is in that direction. And by writing a book criticizing it, he's kind of absolving himself of those sins. And it's very clever. The same with Rem. He's very critical of his own buildings, which then actually, as a critic, kind of takes away your own ammunition, because the architect themselves has kind of revealed the flaws of their own project. So it's a very clever position to take, but I think actually a much more useful thing to do would be not do that kind of work. And actually, if you're against the kind of neoliberal capitalist model, then maybe it's like the Mass Design Group, which is a not-for-profit agency which works, only in the public sector, or a group like Architecture 00, which does the same. They're very kind of ethical in the kinds of projects they choose. So it's a choice as an architect. They're not slaves to the system. They can very easily choose the kind of work that they would like to take on.
This is interesting to me. I don't mean to turn this into an OMA takedown podcast, but something that I've always been interested in is, and I actually wasn't planning on asking you this, but I find this really interesting. As I told you kind of before we started recording, that I went to graduate school really interested in the critical side of graphic design and potentially moving into more of a role of a critic. And while I was studying, kind of shifted that a little bit of really kind of wanting to do both. Wanting to be a practitioner and a critic at the same time. And I'm wondering if you think that's possible. Can you be both inside the system and criticize the system at the same time, or do those come from two different ways that there's always going to be that kind of tension there?
I think it's very dangerous territory, actually. And the example I would hold up is Michael Sorkin, who I honestly think is one of, the 20th century and 21st century's best writers. The stuff he was doing for the Village Voice in the 80s and 90s was just brilliant. Incredibly passionate kind of activist criticism is the model that we all aspire to. And now he has a very corporate architecture practice producing these awful buildings in China, of the kind which maybe 20 years ago or even 10 years ago he would have railed against with, venom. And now he's kind of doing it himself. And I think it is problematic. It's the same with architects who move into criticism. I think it's different. I think there are some architects who are also great writers. I mean, Sam Jacob, who you had on your podcast recently, is an amazing model of someone who combines practice with theory and teaching, and again, brilliant writing. But I don't think he would call himself a critic.
Right. That's what I was going to say too.
It's something that kind of feeds into his practice. So no, I think it is very difficult to do both. You end up kind of tying yourself in ethical and existential knots.
Yeah. So basically you're saying that you're not going back to practice anytime soon.
No, I wouldn't describe myself as an architect anymore. I mean, I'm not, some people say, oh no, you're still a spatial practitioner. Your writing is a means of practice. And I say, no, I'm not. I'm a journalist. My medium is words. I'm not an architect.
Is that important to you to draw that distinction, to say that this is not a type of practice, that this is journalism?
I think it is increasingly. Yeah, I do. I get quite frustrated by the world of, I use the phrase spatial practitioner with inverted commas, because I think, I don't know, over the past, I suppose, decade or so, the kind of industry of biennales and triennales has produced this model of practice that only exists in that realm.
Right.
And it's often the same practitioners speaking to the same audiences about the same fairly kind of esoteric, hermetic ideas. And I suppose my role, in as a critic writing for a general public audience, is to kind of take a sledgehammer to that world of very arcane architectural theorizing and spell it out in straightforward language. I see myself as a journalist, and try to be as straightforward and down to earth and kind of accessible, I suppose, without dumbing down.
I'm curious about your role at The Guardian, where you are writing to a general audience or for a general audience, how you see yourself as some sort of, whether it's kind of translator between the industry or the field and the general audience. How do you fit into that relationship? And specifically at The Guardian, which is different than writing for a architecture publication, like you were just kind of saying.
Yeah, that's a great question. And then, to be honest, it was a huge leap to make. So I spent 2 years working for Building Design Magazine, which is a trade publication. Mm-hmm. So at the time, it was sent to every registered architect in the country, and it was a kind of I think each week I had like one kind of 2,000 word review, and it was a very kind of thorough review of a particular building, usually like the latest building that had been completed that week, generally in the UK, but occasionally internationally. And I was writing very much for an architectural audience, so it could be kind of technical, and I could make references that the educated architect would understand. Moving to The Guardian, which has an audience of 200 million around the world, it was a giant leap, because basically you don't know who your audience is.
Right.
You have to realize that obviously architects are reading your work as well, but like so is your granny, and
right.
So it's anyone in the world, and so you do have to rethink the way you kind of frame everything. And I think that the biggest challenge is that when you're writing for a national or international paper, it's your role to explain to people why architecture matters. Like, why is this stuff relevant? Why on earth should they be reading about the latest building or the latest urban plan? And so you really have to find ways to kind of, to make it relevant and to explain to people why it matters, and that actually this is stuff that affects everyone and their daily lives. So I suppose less time is put into talking about shadow gaps and the way the brick detects the window reveal and the kind of details that I write a lot about for a technical architecture magazine, and much more about the bigger forces, the kind of political, social, and financial forces that are shaping buildings and spaces. So that's what I tend to do much more of at The Guardian.
If it's okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of process and kind of how you go about your writing, because reading through the archives, I think there's a really nice mix of pieces, and I think, like you just said, there's this kind of constant theme that's really become the theme of this conversation about kind of these larger external forces and how they influence the built world. And you move nicely between what I'm going to call kind of more traditional reviews. You kind of go to a building, you go to an exhibition, and you kind of talk about it, mixed with pieces that are a little bit more longer form. They're kind of pulling back a little bit to look at larger trends. 2 of yours that I read recently was about the influence of Instagram on architecture, or like the pencil buildings of pencil skyscrapers of New York, which is not necessarily a specific building, or even like the Instagram one, you're not talking about a specific place, although you have a lot of examples, but it's kind of looking at these larger themes. Are these things, I guess I have 2 questions, and you can kind of pick which one you want to answer them however you want. Are you kind of thinking about these things and you're pitching these? Is there an editor who's saying, hey, can you write about this building? And then are you thinking about, okay, this is a review, this is more of a long form? How do you kind of approach that process?
Well,
sorry, that was a lot.
Let me start at the beginning because it's a fairly complicated. Well, it's not that complicated. It's changed.
Okay.
So I started at the Guardian in 2012. Until that point, there'd been an architecture critic, Jonathan Glancy, who'd been there for, I think, about 25 years, and he moved on, and they did this kind of very radical thing of actually advertising the job in the newspaper, which they'd never really done. You know, the critics are kind of usually middle-aged and upwards people with, you know, a lot of connections who are kind of ushered into the job.
Right.
And this was an open advert. So I applied along with everyone else in London and beyond who writes about architecture. Right. And they, you know, it was quite a grueling process. There were like 2 rounds of interviews. They got to a short list of about 6 people, I think, and we were all asked to do the job for 10 days, like set up a blog. Imagine you're doing this job. What would you write about? And I was actually away at the time. And so I think as a result, when I got back, I kind of massively overcompensated and thought, shit, everyone else has had 10 days. So I just churned out a huge number of articles or like article ideas. And then when I went for my interview, I made a big thing about saying, actually, you know, we should be covering, I suppose, you know, the 99%. So usually architecture critics write about architecture for the 1%.
Right.
The museums, the galleries, the opera houses, the private houses. I was saying, you know, we need to be writing about healthcare architecture, about schools, about public spaces, about stations, about infrastructure, about, you know, the kinds of things that go under the radar. So they were kind of sold on that idea. And I got the job. And then when I started, it was this huge anticlimax because basically they said to me, oh, no, we kind of want you to be like a one-man version of Dezeen. You know, several articles a day. You know, it's more about quantity, quality. And, you know, I proposed all of these kind of in-depth, long-form, politically and socially led features. And they were like, oh, no, can't you write about the fact that Kanye West wants to be an architect? Or, you know, here's the latest kind of penis-shaped building in Beijing. Can you write a funny blog about that? And so, to be honest, the first 12 months of the job was this constant battle of arguing with my editor, saying, actually, no, you know, the Guardian is a kind of serious platform.
Right.
For slightly more considered criticism, not just churning out blogs that are going to get clicks. And so, yeah, the first year was quite stressful because it was basically an article every day of a kind of shorter, I suppose, lighter nature. And it was quite difficult to do those longer features. And then my editor changed, which, you know, I don't want to get too personal about it, but basically my life changed completely. I finally had someone that kind of understood what I was interested in. And embraced, you know, just the kind of topics that we've been talking about, as you would imagine the Guardian would. But yeah, so the system is basically that I propose whatever topics I think are important. That's the difference, I suppose, with a national paper compared to an architecture magazine, that I'm the only person there who has any interest or knowledge in architecture. So they kind of trust me to tell them what we should be covering. And yeah, the length just totally depends. You know, stuff's going in the paper, it obviously has to be shorter because space is more limited. Right. And then, you know, occasionally I get the luxury of doing something called a long read, which can be up to about 6,000 words. But yeah, it really varies on the topic and whether it's online or in the paper, or, you know, yeah, there's a whole range of things, from kind of 1,000-word quick reviews, which I have to kind of write as soon as I've seen an exhibition, to much more investigative stories that can take, you know, several months of kind of working on in the background. Right. I mean, to be honest, those ones I really enjoy doing and would much rather do many more.
Yeah, I mean, especially kind of hearing how you kind of pitched what you saw the role as. It sounds like those longer pieces are really where your interest is.
Yeah, no, that really is true. I mean, the one you mentioned, the New York Pencil Towers piece, I suppose that's in a way my kind of ideal format. You know, something which takes a phenomenon and really tries to drill down into all of the different factors that have kind of spawned that phenomenon. You know, so I was really trying to explain to people how kind of air rights work, how FAR works, the kind of intricacies of the New York zoning policy, where the funding is coming from for these kinds of buildings, who's buying them. You know, I tried to speak to every kind of party involved in the process, and then basically just explain what's going on, and not, I suppose it wasn't so much a critique. I wasn't really trying to take sides, but I was just explaining the situation and allowing people to make up their own minds, really.
So you've now had this job for 6.5 years. How has it changed, or how has your writing changed, or has the way you kind of approached the job changed over those years?
That's a good question. It's I mean, in a way it's got easier, but partly because, like anything, obviously the more you do it, the more naturally it comes. But it's also a situation when you join such a huge organization, with hundreds of editorial staff, it does take to kind of basically establish yourself and kind of exert your position and get a certain level of trust, I suppose, to the point that editors will happily let you go off and research something properly and not kind of expect the daily blog about whatever is popular on Dezeen that morning. So yeah, the longer I've been there, the more freedom I've had, I would say, to say exactly what I want to write about. And I also, the great thing now is the level of feedback and analytics you get. So
interesting.
In about 2013 maybe, or 14, about a year or two after I'd started, I proposed a very long piece on the planning system, which, given that my editor is an arts editor, I'll come on to that in a minute. Actually, that's one of my long-term frustrations, that architecture is always in the arts for not society. It was a difficult sell, to be honest, a 6,000 word essay on problems with the planning system. But anyway, they allowed me to do it, and it was one of my most popular articles ever. Hundreds of thousands of people read it in a really unexpected way. And so that at least gave me some kind of ammunition that I could go back to my editor and say, look, there is appetite for very long, detailed essays about problems with the planning system. Please let me do more. And so they did. And so I've done, a few of those now. And that's the really great thing about having this kind of detailed level of analytics, that I have instant feedback about what kinds of stories are popular. And also this thing called engagement. It's not just about how many people click on these things, but it's about how long they stay, and then also what they click on next. So if I can prove that I've built myself a community, that's how they like to refer to our readers. If I can say, look, I have this loyal community of thousands of readers all around the world who are interested in these kinds of topics, this is what I need to be writing about, then that's a really helpful way of me convincing the powers that be.
That's actually really encouraging too, because so often the narrative around analytics and clicks is that the audience and the readers want the quick stuff. They want the Dezeen stuff that they were trying to get you to do 6 years ago. And so to hear that these longer pieces are doing that also is actually encouraging. I think is worth celebrating for a second.
Yeah. No, I was really happy and quite surprised, to be honest. And it's interesting, people say, oh, the internet, it just means people want to read short stuff. That's really not true. And I think the rise of mobile devices, this is the fascinating thing. I can see if people are reading my articles on a mobile device or on a desktop. And the longer pieces are much more read on a mobile, because I think actually you forget, when you're just on the tube or on a bus or, doing whatever and scrolling with your thumb, you don't really realize actually, how many thousands of words you're reading. Because it's a constant scroll. And if you saw the length of the articles that you read laid out in a newspaper, I'm sure it would look, overwhelming and much more off-putting.
Right.
But there's something about the mobile format that actually I think encourages people to consume longer form journalism much more easily than they would if it was in print or perhaps on a desktop.
I want to kind of completely shift gears and I feel like we should talk a little bit about your book on North Korea. I know you've talked about it a lot. It's gotten a lot of press. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think I imagine a lot of people are aware of it, but I'm thinking about it actually in the context of this conversation we've been having about the influence of these external forces on the built environment. And I'm kind of suddenly realizing that inside North Korea is almost like a perfect case study of this thesis that you've been putting forward for the last kind of 10 years in your writing. Do you see it like that? Or maybe before we even get into that, can you kind of just give a quick overview of what that book is and how you think about it, and then how it kind of maybe relates to this larger conversation we've been having and the rest of your work?
Sure. So yeah, the book came about because quite a few years ago now, probably 2014 or 13, I pitched an idea to my editor about a feature on the architecture and urbanism of Pyongyang, just because I'd seen photos, I think, at one of the Venice Architecture Biennales, and it just looked like a fascinating place, obviously. And they said, okay, fine, as long as you go as a tourist and we have nothing to do with it. I was like, okay. Obviously the Guardian's very sensitive. It was the same when I went to Iran. I couldn't go as a journalist, so I kind of went on holiday to Iran and then wrote about it afterwards. And it was the same with North Korea. I had to join a kind of package tour of holidaymakers on this. It was a kind of architectural tour, so it was about 10 days of seeing all of these architectural sites in Pyongyang. But I'd made an agreement with the company that took me there. I said, I want to write about this. I am a journalist. I'm not trying to like sneak onto your tour undercover. And so amazingly, they negotiated with the North Korean partners, and they said, okay, as long as you just focus on architecture and urbanism and it's not a kind of human rights expose, then it's fine. So actually, I got a lot more access than I would have done if I'd gone as an official journalist, because they really restrict journalists' movements. You're kind of flown in, shown, the one particular site they want you to see, and then you're flown straight out again. And I realized that actually going as a tourist, they're less strict. It's still obviously very stage managed, choreographed, but you do get to see a lot more. So I did that, and I wrote a long piece for The Guardian, and I think, I started a blog called North Korean Interiors.
Oh, right. I remember that now.
Yeah, so that came out, 2 or 3 years before the book. Which was my photographs of interiors, which I don't know if I can say they went viral, but they were popular online.
Yeah, they were definitely popular.
Yeah, they had that kind of surreal, Wes Anderson quality, something about the color palettes and the symmetry, and just this amazing kind of time warp feeling. And then a few architecture photographer friends of mine, I've never called myself a photographer. I'm just like an enthusiastic amateur. And they were like, oh, yeah, you should do a book. So it was a kind of joke in the pub one day. But, like those jokes, it often happens, you kind of accidentally turns into reality. I emailed Taschen, and they were very interested. And, before I knew it, they work incredibly quickly. A few months later, the book was on the shelves. So that's how it happened. And it forced me, it was great to have an opportunity to, I wrote a much longer, 8,000 or 9,000 word essay about the history of how the North Korean regime has used architecture as a very powerful tool to kind of reinforce the ideology. Compared to any other city in the world, I suppose it's the place where you can really feel the connection between architecture and the ideology that's created it explicitly. Every move in the urban plan has been done for a reason. And so, I got really into it and got really kind of in depth, and have been doing, quite a few kind of lectures and exhibitions based on the book over the last year.
I mean, that's what I think is actually the most interesting about it, especially hearing that, you had to kind of negotiate with the North Korean partners, and that if you're going to write about it, you couldn't write about these certain things.
Yeah.
But you kind of were able to through the lens of architecture. Like, it isn't just, it is about the ideology that these buildings and these interiors are kind of making reality. You are kind of, you're still able to. It's not like you're just kind of ignoring all of that.
Sure. And it's not censored. They didn't ask to see the text or anything like that. So, I mean, they're quite happy to accept criticism. It was more just that the guides, but basically that if you go on one of these tours, you get shown what they want to show you.
Right.
There's no, you can't say, oh, can I go and see a labor camp, or can you take me to the local prison, or the lower class housing district around the back. You see the showcase projects, and that was made very clear. And I make that clear in the book. It's not a kind of undercover reportage. It's very much, this is what they want to show the outside world.
Right.
But I suppose in my essay, I was able to delve into the mechanics behind architecture and the urban planning, and the meanings, the ideology, and be critical.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's focused specifically on I suppose architecture and planning. But the really unexpected outcome, actually, I did an exhibition in Paju, which is a town in South Korea, very close to the border.
Yeah.
With the north, and the kind of chief city architect of Seoul came to see it, and he said, "Oh, we should move this to Seoul. There's a space in the city hall.
Oh, wow.
Where we could put it." And so, a few weeks later, this exhibition appeared in the government building in the capital of South Korea. Which is the first time they'd ever kind of acknowledged the North publicly and politically in that way. And that's what dawned on me, actually, that architecture is a relatively neutral ground and kind of means of communication and potential collaboration between the two sides. And so since then, I've been meeting with some Korean curators who are going to be doing the Seoul Biennale this coming year. And they're really trying to do a partnership with Pyongyang and use architecture as a means of cultural exchange, in a way kind of bypassing the political level, and architects speaking directly to architects. So, it's really promising, actually. The power, I don't want to overplay the power of these photos, but it's amazing how they have proved to be a kind of diplomatic tool in a way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What are you thinking about now? What are the topics or subjects that you find yourself gravitating towards, or things you're writing about currently, or things that you want to write about in the future?
Well, I'm not sure I can really give away. Okay. I should say check The Guardian in a few weeks.
Right.
But no, lots of things. I suppose one of the things I've been really interested in recently is the kind of commodification of co-living. So, house sharing has obviously been a reality for generations. What we're seeing now in London and New York and all over the world is kind of companies capitalizing on the idea of sharing and basically monetizing the sharing experience. And so WeWork, fastest growing companies in the world, has moved into We Live, where they're basically doing the same thing they did for shared workspace, but for housing. There's a group in London called The Collective, where you pay £1,000 a month for about 10 square meters. So, just about room to have a single bed.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hotel living, and then there are all these shared amenities where you can hang out and meet like-minded people. But they've got around the statutory space standards. There are very specific policies in London for how small an apartment can be. But because they're classed as a different use, they fall into the same use class as hotels. They're allowed to bypass those kinds of regulations. And so I shouldn't explain everything that I'm going to be writing.
Right.
But that's looking into how these very powerful companies with a huge amounts of financial backing are kind of commodifying the idea of co-living, and that is the future. They're buying up huge amounts of property in most major global cities. And then another thing I'm looking into at the moment, I guess along similar lines, is how tech companies are increasingly becoming developers. So maybe 2 years ago, I did a piece on kind of Silicon Valley urbanism, looking at the main offices of Facebook, Google, Apple, kind of what the architecture said about those companies.
Yeah, I remember that. I forgot about that piece.
Yeah, well, since then, they've really expanded their kind of urban planning ambitions. Google has a master plan for several thousand housing units in Mountain View. Facebook has commissioned OMA to design a kind of Facebook village. And they're realizing, it's because of the really damaging effect they're having on the nearby city.
Right.
Forcing people out and driving up rents. They're having to build affordable housing for their workers in order to stop that being a problem. So yeah, that's something that I'm looking into at the moment. What the nature of kind of tech-driven urbanism is going to be, and the future of things like Google's Sidewalk Labs, using algorithms to kind of generate the ideal city.
Yeah, I love both of those.
Yeah, there's two future features coming up.
Yeah, both of those are right down my my interest also. So I can't wait for both of those. My last question is, I'm curious. You've mentioned a couple people, a couple writers throughout this conversation, but I'm curious, who are the critics or the writers or the books that have really shaped how you think about all of this, or how you think about your work, or what kind of how you want your work to be seen? Who are those people that have influenced you?
Yeah, no, there's a few. I mean, I suppose in the UK, I would say Ian Nairn was always a touchstone. He was a critic and writer in the kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, who wrote. He had a column called Outrage in the Architectural Review, where every month he would kind of rage against something. But it was such beautiful prose. There's a book called Nairn's London, where he kind of goes around the city, basically describing every building of any historic importance. And it's just, the nature of his language is just beautiful. I mean, that's one thing we haven't talked about, actually, the nature of language itself. I do it is really important for your writing to kind of be engaging and entertaining, as well as like critical and powerful and radical and all the other things that we've been talking about. It has to be a kind of beauty to the prose. And Ian Nairn, to me, really kind of embodies that. Just some of the kind of metaphors and ways he describes buildings, you would never really think about or come up with.
Right.
So yeah, he's a touchstone. I suppose in terms of contemporary critics, my own colleague on The Observer, which is the Guardian on a Sunday, Rowan Moore, I think he's a brilliant writer. And to be honest, it's quite a kind of intimidating position having him as a colleague, because he's just great. I think he's the way he writes and the kinds of topics that he tackles. Who else? I think in the States, I really miss the writing of Chris Hawthorne, who I know you had on your podcast. His voice on the LA Times. It was always the first thing. If I wanted to know what was going on the West Coast, I would turn to him. And it's interesting, actually, his shift. It's almost the opposite to me, starting out in the GLA in London and then becoming a writer. He's gone from being a critic to basically being the design officer for Los Angeles.
Right.
I haven't spoken to him since then. I need to catch up on your interview, but I would imagine it's been a huge culture shock, because from the outside, you feel, oh yeah, I'll be able to go into that political context and make a difference. I think it's only when you're there you realize quite how impossible it is to change anything, without years and years of work.
Yeah.
So I really hope he manages to have an effect from the inside.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Owen Hatherley is brilliant. He's one of the most kind of fierce political voices that we have. It's a very different approach to me. I mean, I suppose we're contemporaries. We've been writing pretty much the same time. I suppose he's a few years older than me, and I suppose his approach, whenever he's asked to review a building or a place, he'll kind of go there, but explicitly not talk to the architects or not talk to the developer or talk to the people. It's very much about his personal reaction to a place. And I suppose I have the complete opposite approach, which is I go somewhere and I try and speak to as many people as possible.
Right.
I'll speak to the developer, the funder, the planning officer, the architect, the user of the building, and then try and, I suppose, synthesize that into something. But no, I think he's brilliant and very kind of consistent in his opinions. So, yeah.
I know I said that was the last question, but then you talking about kind of language and kind of the craft of writing. I didn't mean to limit that question to just architecture critics. And so if you have even other just writers that you would say kind of influence the way you think about writing, or that you just kind of love their language, you can add some of those too.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one, he was a critic, but very different to architecture. I don't know if you know the work of A. Gill.
No, I've never heard that name.
No, okay. Well, he was a restaurant critic in London for I think it was for the Times for a long time, and he died recently away with words. He was famously dyslexic, and I remember reading that actually dyslexia means often that you come up with the kind of imagery and metaphors that a non-dyslexic person wouldn't. The way the mind works, it kind of puts together concepts and ideas in a very different way. And so his kind of analogies and similes were amazing. Just combinations of ideas that I would struggle to ever imagine. Yeah. And he famously dictated his articles, because his spelling was so bad. He would kind of read them to a secretary, and it's that's something I've never tried doing, but I wonder if that influenced the nature of the prose as well somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of him before. I'm gonna have to look that up.
Yeah, it's worth looking up. Very acerbic and venomous in his most damning reviews.
I love that.
Which actually, maybe I should mention that. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and we were both agreeing how difficult it is to write about good buildings without feeling like you're drifting into the language of a kind of press release or a kind of promotional booster.
Yeah.
It's much easier and actually more pleasurable to write a kind of damning review than trying to explain why something is so good, without falling into the inevitable cliches.
Right.
I recently saw a building in Switzerland that was just flawless, in every way imaginable. It was just perfect. And it was a real struggle to write the review without just sounding like I was the kind of PR person for the business. So it's a much harder challenge writing about things you love.
Yeah, I actually kind of like ending on that kind of like both positive and kind of positive note? Yeah. Oliver, thank you so much. This was so fun for me. Like I said, I'm a big fan of you and your work, and this was great to talk to you about all of this.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the conversation. It was quite cathartic for me as well, I have to say.
Good. I'm glad. This episode was recorded on February 13th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.